Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, the channel where we are making a computer role-playing game using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. So last video we ended up with a encounter which works, but which I said had a couple of problems with it. And in this video I'm going to talk about those problems and about possible ways to solve them. Just to refresh your memory, this is what we have so far. The player chooses their race by clicking on the picture of the dwarf, elf or human, and you can then adjust they can then adjust their attributes if they want to. You can also change your mind and click on a different race to what you initially chose, but once you're ready, you are told that you must cross the river. And the choices are to wade across the river or cross over the bridge. Wading across the river generates or leads to a roll which is based upon size. And if the character's size attribute is too small, they find themselves drowning. And the crossing over the bridge causes a roll based on strength, as the monster that guards the bridge sizes them up. And that might end up with them being hurled to their death, or it might end up with the monster letting them across the bridge or asking them a riddle. So what are the problems or the potential problems with this? Well, one problem is that it's quite chaotic. When we're rolling against an attribute, the computer does the equivalent of rolling a 20-sided dice. It generates a random number from 1 to 20. And most attributes are going to be fairly close to 10, which means that the chance, or to 10 or 11, which means that the chance of success or failure is going to be close to 50%. Obviously, if you've got a high attribute, it's more likely. If you've got a low attribute, it's less likely. But most of the time, it's going to be close-ish to 50%. And that means that the player might find the experience a bit random. There might be a feeling of, well, you just sort of see what happens when the dice get rolled. And that might not be desirable. So how can we deal with that if we still want to have rolling against attributes? Well, one way we can do that is, and I'll just get out of the game and get into Twine itself, and I'll get into the relevant bit of code. So what we've got here is it generates this random number between 1 and 20, so essentially rolls a 20-sided dice, and then compares it against the relevant attribute, and if the roll is higher than the attribute, then the player is deemed to have failed, and otherwise they're deemed to have succeeded. But of course, we don't have to use 1 to 20. We could use, like that, a random number from 1 to 10 and another random number from 1 to 10. That would be called rolling 2d10 in tabletop role-playing, or rolling 2 10-sided dice. And that will give you a similar range of numbers. You can't actually roll a 1 doing it this way. Or we could do it this way. We could roll the equivalent of 3 normal 6-sided dice, and that will give you a roll, a range between 3 and 18, so you can't ever get a 1 or 2 or 19 or 20. But although the range of numbers is very similar, the results tend to cluster in the middle more the more dice you have. So if you're rolling a single dice, or a single die, if you insist, every result is equally likely. But if I'm rolling 3 6-sided dice, a 10 or an 11 is much more likely than a 3 or an 18, which are the extremes. To roll a 3, I need to get a 1 and a 1 and a 1. So there's only one possible way that can happen. Whereas to roll a 10, I could get, for example, a 2, then a 5, then a 3, or a 1, then a 6, then a 3, or a 4 and then a 4 and then a 2, or etc. etc. There's a lot more combinations which end up getting 10 or 11 than end up getting the ones at the extremes. And then if I roll 2 10-sided dice, that's sort of in between. It's a little bit clustered, but not as much clustered as if I were rolling 3d6. And the point of that is that it makes high attributes more likely to succeed and low attributes more likely to fail. It moves the percentage chance of success, or tends to move the percentage chance of success away from 50%. And that makes results more predictable. And that's not inherently a good thing or a bad thing. Different people have different sort of tolerances for randomness, I suppose, different amounts of randomness that they like. A bit of randomness is quite good because it makes the game unpredictable and interesting, and it can create new sort of possibilities and make people want to sort of find out what else can happen. But it has the downside of it can just feel like it's sort of a ride, and the player can feel like, well, my choices don't really matter. What really matters is whether I roll well, sort of thing. So it's different with different players. Like, you know, the same game, one person might say it's way too random, and one person might say, no, it's really good, it's just right. You're just going to have to sort of make a personal choice and or get as much feedback as you can to try and sort of set the randomness of your game where you want it to be. But the point is that if we wanted to sort of still have random rolls, but make them less random, make them a little bit more predictable, one way to do that is by using more dice, or instead of just a random from the high to the low, having 1 to 10 plus 1 to 10, or 1 to 6 plus 1 to 6 plus 1 to 6. Another technique that you can use, and this is often used in tabletop role-playing games, is to give the player some sort of method of managing the results of rolls. So that might mean that they have a certain number of rerolls. So, for example, they might say you have 3 rerolls for the whole game, or you have a luck score, and that luck score determines how many rerolls you get. And every time you fail a roll, you can use up a reroll to try again. But once you use up the rerolls, they're gone. And if you have no rerolls, you stop getting that option, right? Another option is to have some sort of luck points, and you might say, well, okay, you failed this roll by 4, so therefore you can sacrifice 4 luck points and turn that failure into a success. But once those luck points are gone, they're gone forever. So the player has to decide, if this particular failure is a sort of critical one, or if they want to save up their resource for the end when it might be more important. Usually players don't care if they succeed by luck. That can feel like a sort of treat, as long as it doesn't happen all the time and remove all challenge from the game. But the occasional situation where they should fail, but they get lucky, isn't likely to be a problem. But what is likely to be a problem is when they do everything right but fail because the dice were against them. And as I say, if you have a mechanism for managing luck, that can feel a bit more like, well, I used up my luck points too early and then I was unlucky. And that can feel a bit more like, well, I didn't play the game optimally and that's why I lost, as opposed to I just lost because I wasn't lucky. And if you feel like you didn't play the game optimally and that's why you lost, that can create the desire to sort of play it again and do better, which is what you want. Now, in a future video, I will get into the details of how you might code a system for doing that, but just to sort of raise the possibility that the results of the rolls don't have to be final. You can have some sort of luck point system or system for managing, for managing the results of luck, or particularly for managing the bad results of luck, because the good results of luck are usually welcomed. The second problem that I noticed is, and we'll just go back to the, nope, that's the wrong tab. We'll just go back to the game, wherever that is. Oh, there it is. Sorry about that. So you have the option of wading across the river, which leads to a roll against your size attribute, or crossing over the bridge, which leads to rolls against your strength attribute. Now, the elf usually will have low strength and low size. So one of those options is going to be sort of better, but they're still both bad. And if the person has played the game a few times, and they get into this situation and feel like, well, I've got two choices, but both the choices are bad, and both the choices are probably going to end up with me dying. So it's not really a choice. I mean, in that particular case, we got lucky, but generally speaking, if we'd done that, you would find yourself dying. So it can feel like, well, it's presented as a choice, but it's not really a choice because I die in both cases. And depending on how you've set up the encounter, like if every person who plays the game, every time you play the game, if you get that far, you have to try and cross the river, well, that can mean that playing an elf means that you're going to lose, right? And generally you don't want that, right? Generally, I mean, you can have some character options that are slightly better than others, but if there's one where it just can't win, if you choose an elf, you're just going to lose the game, that feels a bit pointless. People are just not going to pick elves, and it's going to feel like, well, why do you give me the option to be an elf if being an elf just means losing? So how could you deal with that? Well, I've already talked about rerolls and using luck points, but of course, if your attribute is low and you do a reroll, you're probably going to fail the reroll as well, right? If you have a system where you can sacrifice points depending on how much you lost by, well, if your attribute's low, you might lose by a huge amount. So you don't have the option of doing that either. So they can help a little bit, but you might still have the problem. And there's broadly two approaches you can make. One is you could say, well, one option leads to a sort of roll against strength and one option leads to a roll against size. So why don't I have a third option that leads to a roll against something else? So let's say I'll put in an option which is I'll convince someone to row me across the bridge, and then that'll be a roll against charisma, and the elf has a high charisma, so that'll be a good option for the elf. And that can be fine if you make sure that there's always a good option for each character. Like, what if there's a character that doesn't have strength or size or charisma? What if they happen to have, intelligence and constitution? So that's a way to solve it for individual cases, but it might not work as a sort of general. It can help certainly, but it might not work as a sort of general strategy. Although it's always worth having more options, just because it makes the encounters more interesting. It gives the players more choices. I'm not saying don't put in more options. Certainly, if you think of more options, do put them in, because it makes the game more interesting. But as a specific solution to the problem of having a character that's not viable in a particular encounter, I don't know that it's always going to be a solution to that. So what I would suggest is making the consequences of encounters less completely fatal. In this particular case, because we've only got one encounter, I set it up that if you fail this roll, you lose, and I set it up that if you fail the other roll, if you rolled 2 failures, you lose completely, right? Your character dies and you lose the game. Oh, no! Sorry, my alarm just went off. That's all right, I'm going to keep going. I've been going for long enough. Where was I? Yes, right. So what I think is a more sort of complete solution is to have consequences that aren't that the player completely loses, it's that the player loses some sort of resource. So, for example, often in tabletop role-playing games, you have hit points or something equivalent to hit points, and instead of having the monster hurl you from the bridge and you die, you might say, okay, the monster hurls you from the bridge and you lose 3 hit points, but you manage to get over, manage to swim over the river or something like that. Instead of having the river drown you, you might say, okay, you swallow a bit of water and you lose whatever. You lose hit points, or you lose luck, or you lose something, but you get across and you can keep going. And that way, when the player dies, it won't be the consequence of one failed roll. It'll be a consequence of it'll be a consequence of 2 or 3 failed rolls, and it'll feel a bit more. It'll feel a bit more fair, right? It'll feel a bit more like, well, I could have chosen differently in that particular encounter, and I was unlucky there, and that feels a bit better than, okay, you've got these 2 choices, but guess what? Both of them are probably going to kill you. Make things less complete. Have a resource that failure eats into, as opposed to having failure be completely fatal. A variant on that is that you can have gold or credits, or whatever, money, and money can be a solution, but that gets used up. So in this particular case, you might say, we can wade across the river, you can cross over the bridge, there's a ferryman who will take you across for 10 gold or something. And if you're the elf, you go, well, I can't really, I know, let's say the player has played this before a few times, they might say, all right, well, I know that if I wade across the river or cross over the bridge, I might die, so I will use up my gold in this particular situation. But then in another situation, you might have the option to use your gold or roll against charisma, and the elf player, if they've played the game and know the situations, will say, well, in that case, I won't use my gold. I'll rely on my charisma to get by. So there's an element of sort of resource management. Effectively, it allows the player to avoid having to roll, and if they choose well, they can avoid the rolls that they're more likely to lose. And again, so if they lose, it feels a bit more fair. It feels a bit like, well, I shouldn't have made that risk. I shouldn't have used my gold up in the previous encounter. I probably could have got by, with the consequences of that one, and I really should have saved it up and used it in this one. And it feels a bit more like it's more likely to leave the player thinking, okay, well, I want to play it again and sort of do better, as opposed to it's a dumb game and it's not fair and it's no fun, which of course is not what you want. So those are a couple of sort of obvious problems, and obviously the reason that I've raised them is because in my experience they might they tend to come up a lot, and they might come up in your game. I know that I talked about coding rerolls and having rerolls and using luck, and I didn't teach you how to code it, just because that would have made the video too long. I will do that next time. But I hope that what I've said is useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.